Is it sad? Does it fill you with grief? There's only one more day of React. Or you're like, yes, finally, we can move on to something else. Okay, cool. So we are live. Excellent. How's everyone doing? Conflicted. All right. So anyone other than Ariel's question on use effect, are there any other questions that we want to address at the start of class before we dive back into our application, which we should be able to finish this thing off before break? There's really only a few more pieces. And then for the remainder of class, we'll dive more into state and how we can use state in different ways across our application. We're using it in the most simplified form right now, but state can be a lot more complex than that. And so I want to start to introduce some of the concepts of how to handle state in various capacities. So before we get into the app and everything, other than use effect, any other questions that we should take care of or clarifications?
I'm not sure what the question about use effect is, but I had a quick question about use effect. For the parameters, because they have the same key name and like the variable name, so we're only using one word for them. The array at the end of use effect, if those had different names, are those the keys or are those the variables? They're the keys, right? What you would put in there?
And for use effect, you're talking about that dependency array.
Yeah.
Is the second argument.
Yeah.
So those are direct. You would put like values that you want to track in there, whether they're variables or props. They're not arbitrary. They're the actual values you want to track to see changes with.
I'm wondering if, like, when it says query, is that referring to query the key, the parameter key, or the variable?
For query.
Use effect. I'm sorry, on the search page?
On the search. Okay, let me go to the search page. So search page.js.
Yeah.
Okay, use effect. Oh, query. Yeah, that is
all of them really.
The variable. That's the variable that holds our queries, the state of query.
Okay, I was a little confused because the keys had the same names as the variables. Thank you.
That's the one thing with it makes it easier and harder at the same time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just wanted to specify that for future projects. Thank you.
Okay, sure. All right, let's go over. Oh, so that was your issue with
no, I'm all set. Thank you. Just it was much more simplified the way Kyle asked than what I was going for. That's perfect.
Look at that. Twofer right there. Excellent. Love it. Cool. So what do you say we finish this application and get on to some other things after that. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, did everyone pull the latest? I pushed everything up last night. For sure, I made sure this time that I pushed everything up. Okay, cool. Share screen. Why isn't share screen? There we go. So we're going to introduce a fun little third-party component tonight called Toast. Well, the generic term is Toast. I believe it's React Toastify is the library that we will be using. I don't know. I like Toasts. I think they're fun. You can do some pretty cool little effects with these things. So let's see. We're done with the search page. We were working on product detail page. Why do I have cart page open? I'm not sure. Okay. Let's see. Oh, let's start this thing up. So everyone run npm start so we can see our application. And I believe we finished out the cart page completely last night, right? If I'm not mistaken. We added, the last thing I think we did was adding to the cart on the product detail page, if memory serves me correctly. And it doesn't always do so. Come on, you can do it. Let's see. Product detail page. At any rate, we'll definitely need product detail page open. Oh yeah, so it looks like we did all of this. Right, we called. Oh, here, this is what we did. Cart add, right? So we created the button. We're going to show this toast thing. There we go. We've got shop. Click the thing, right? And then add to cart. And we should see that stuff in the cart, which we do. But we want, when you add something to a cart, what's the typical user experience? What's your typical user experience on a website where you're adding things to your cart? What happens, or what do you usually expect to happen? An alert, right? So some sort of notification that says, hey, you added something to the cart, right? Sometimes you'll have like a little fly out that comes out. Sometimes it'll just be a little message, things like that, right? So we want to tell the user, hey, you were successful in adding that thing to the cart. So let's add that in. So I'm going to bring up the documentation for React Toastify. Now this is in the Google Classroom under Module 6. There's that resources spreadsheet. I put all these links to all my bookmarks in there for this class. So you'll have access to all those resources as well. So basically what this is its sole purpose is to create little pop-ups. That's all it does. So we can come down here, we can say show toast. We can see this thing shows up. You can do, as you can see, there's like a little timer going on. If I hover over, it stops the timer. I can dismiss it by swiping it away or clicking this, right? There's a whole bunch of different attributes you can give this thing. You can show different contexts, right? So it's like, whoa, that probably is great for an error. Usually red is a good contextual color for errors. Info, what does that look like? That's blue, right? So default, I believe, is just white, which is the one we'll be using. I mean, you can use whatever you want. But essentially what we do, they tell you exactly how to use it, right? So once you install the package, we'll have to npm install it. You import and use what's called their toast container. And that takes a bunch of different props to basically, tell it what it can and can't do, right? And then to actually initiate that thing, we have to import and use this function called toast. And what it does is it looks for the next toast on the page. If it finds it, or if it finds it in that component, it'll launch it. And these are some more things that you can do on top of all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to import these things. Well, first of all, we have to install the package. So let's get to that. Do they have the instructions right here? No. Installation, yes, right there. So this is what we want. npm install save React Toastify. So I will put, well, we can just type it out. But I'll put this link in the chat as well. So we have it. That's in the students Slack chat. All right. So let's go and let me do this. Let me put this down here. I can see it. We need to stop our server. So Control C, because we can't install any packages while our server is running. It won't let us. And then once that's done, we'll say npm install -- save react - toastify. Well, it takes a little bit. Pretty heavy package. Or my connection's slow because I'm on Zoom. One of those two. Or both. Okay, hopefully this will be completed soon. All right, added 2 packages. Excellent. All right, so give me a thumbs up when everyone's at the point where it's done installing. People still waiting? All right. We'll give it another minute. Give me a sec to open up my notes. Okay, cool. All right, so once you're ready, you can do npm start, fire up your server again. And we're going to need to make a new folder for this component. So in your components folder, oh, that's because that's restarting. That's fine. All right, so in your components folder, we want to create a new folder called toast. We're just going to call it toast instead of toastify. And in here, create a new file called toast. Oh, come on. Toast.js. Now, I did a little research on this toast, so we'll be able to kind of go through this pretty quick, at least to get it up and going. If you want to play around with the settings and everything, read their documentation, see what all the options are available to you, and then just kind of play around with that whenever you want. But we're going to go through and just kind of fill this thing out, and I'll give an explanation of one particular thing that I'm doing that is not in their documentation to make our lives easier for our project. So we're going to import some things from React Toastify. And we want the toast container that they talk about. We want the toast function, their emitter function that launches the toast. And I chose to bring in something called slide. So this will slide it into view instead of just popping it up. So it's nice when you have like smooth transitions to elements instead of just these jarring things. Unless it's an error, then it kind of makes sense to be like, bam, there's an error in front of your face. So all right, so what we're going to do is we also need to import their particular styles, right? When I was playing around with this, I had to dig a little bit into the documentation to figure out why the styles weren't working for me. And it turns out we just need to import those styles. The same way that we are importing our styles like this, we're going to import their styles from the npm package. So we're going to import React Toastify /dist, which stands for distribution. So that's the standard distribution folder. that's a common pattern across all node modules. React toastify.min.css. So they have some minified CSS that we can use. They also have the unminified CSS, but what that does is it adds a lot of extra, like it's got all their comments in it and everything like that, right? We don't really necessarily need that. We just want to pull in the minified one so that we have a smaller, it loads faster. I mean, you're not going to notice the difference, but on a really slow connection, you'll notice a difference. Cool. So now we have their components, their functions, and their functionality for transitions. Now let's create this thing. First, what we're going to do is we're going to export const toast equals toast container. So this is our component. And all we're really doing at this point, because this is their component, I'm just renaming it to toast. That's all I'm doing. I'm saying, hey, my component is the same as this thing, but I'm calling it toast instead of toast container. So you can rename any sort of thing like that. You could say export const toasty equals, toast container. You could, whatever you want to do, right? To me, toast container is just something long to type out over and over again if I had to do it. So I like to rename things that just make sense to call it toast since that's what it is. The other thing we need to do is we need to export the trigger, the toast trigger. But what we're going to do instead of what they're doing is we're going to create a wrapper function around it to make it easier to provide different text. And what I mean by that, I'll show you in a second here. So export const show toast. That's going to be equal to a function. And what this function is going to do is going to call their toast. And this is, if we go by their documentation, we can see the first thing you pass is the message. Okay, that's the first parameter. The second one is this giant object of different options to give to our toast container. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say added to cart. The second thing is an object. There's a whole bunch of options. The ones I chose were position, which is top dash center. This is as a string. Auto close. This is a number that represents the amount of milliseconds to wait until you close the toast automatically. I chose 2000 for 2 seconds. Seemed to be a nice, 2 seconds seems to be long enough. Like any more than that, and then me personally, I get a little antsy and I want to close it. And then hide progress bar set to true. I don't necessarily need to see that rainbow thing. Close on click, we want that set to true. So if the user wants to close it by clicking on it before the 2 seconds is up, we will allow them to do that. Pause on hover, we'll set that to true as well. So if they want to hover over it without clicking it, they just hover over it, it'll stop that timer that waits the 2 seconds. And so the timer won't count down again until the user removes their mouse from over top of it, or their cursor. The other thing is draggable, which I'm going to set to true. What that means is that if you are on, let's say you're on a mobile device, you can just swipe it, get rid of it, you're dragging it. Or if you're on a desktop, you can click and drag it and swipe it, and that will dismiss it as well. So they've got all kinds of options in here. Progress, I'm going to leave as undefined. That's per their documentation. I think that's, oh, that was for the progress bar. Since we're hiding it, we're just going to pass undefined. So I think there was some issue where if you hide the progress bar, but you don't give it a type, like if you give it a type of progress, I think it actually causes some weirdness. I think that's what it was. I remember experimenting with it a little bit. And then transition. What type of transition do we want? Well, we imported their slide transition, which is like a custom object that you can create your own custom transitions. If you read through their documentation, you pass it like this object or function or something like that, and it can get pretty complex. So we're going to use one of their pre-made ones just to make our lives easier. Since they've already made our lives easier by providing all this functionality, figured we'll go with that. So we'll save that. Now you may be thinking like, well, okay, well, why don't I just call their toast? Why do I need to have it in a function? And the reason I did it like this, let's say you want to show a toast for, I don't know, successfully adding something to your wish list, right? So let's say we implemented a wish list. They can click on this item, it adds it to their wish list, and it shows a pop-up. Well, how would I do that if I already hard-coded this as added to cart? I'd have to create another one of these things, right? That doesn't make any sense. So instead of doing that, show toast that we created will take a parameter. We're taking an argument, yeah, a parameter called text. Oops, sorry, text. And we'll just pass that to the toast thing, right? So we're going to provide the message when we call show toast. That way, no matter how many times we call or where we call toast, we'll pass in whatever verbiage that we want to display. That way, we don't have to create this giant object over and over and over again every time we want to call a toast. We simply wrap it with our own function, pass in the message we want, and pass that down to toast. Does that make sense? We're just passing along our own dynamic value that we can call anywhere. Cool. So now let's import this thing into, well, this is basically complete. So let me add my notes that I put in here, and I'll paste this into the chat. You can also see this in the completed code too. So toast.js. In case you were still typing, you can just copy paste that. All right, cool. So let's go to product detail page. And at the top, we're going to import toast and show toast from, I don't want, nope, I don't want that. From, let's see, we need to go up a directory, down into toast, and toast. So go up .. toast. Now with this particular component, it basically just has to be somewhere in our other component. Let me see where I put it.
Kyle wants to know, I think Latoni asked a similar question actually earlier, but could you just do the import as like import curly braces toast container as toast?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, you can do it either way. Either way, I did it this way because I'm calling my component file toast, so I'm exporting it from there. But you could absolutely import right from their library anywhere and just say toast container as toast. That's perfectly fine too. Yeah. Okay, so I just put it if you go all the way down to the bottom of the component for product detail page, before the last div, that's where we're going to place our toast component. It just has to be somewhere in the rendered down, basically, because we won't see that thing until we actually call the show toast method. All right, so now we can uncomment this. Now that we have access to show toast added to cart. So now when we add stuff to the cart, let's see what happens. Here's our toast. Notice it's not going away because I'm hovering over it, or I can swipe it away. And after 2 seconds, it should automatically dismiss, or clicking the X also dismisses it. So feel free to play around with that. Yeah, and you can even say something like, let's do this. Let's say added quantity items to cart, right? It's whatever message we want in there. I could say add 3, added 3 items to cart, right? So you can get creative with that. I see people smiling at that, so it's like other people enjoy these things as much as I do. Cool. Any questions on toast and what we did there? Pretty simple, right? We're just using something that's already created. And they do have great documentation, so that's another good thing to look out for when you're choosing. If you find a component library out there that you think you want to use, look at their documentation. How well is it written? You know, when's the last time they updated it? Let's take a look at React Toastify. When's the last time they actually worked on this thing? Let's go to their GitHub. 2 months ago. Okay, so someone worked on this 2 months ago. So pretty recent, right? Yeah, last commit was on April 23rd. So it's still being maintained. There's still people working on it. Let's see, there's only 17 issues, which is pretty good considering a lot of packages out there have like hundreds, right? Let's see, it starred almost 7,000 times. It's been forked 373 times. So people have created their own version of it or have been contributing to it. So you can fork a repository, work on it locally, submit a pull request, the same way that I'm working on this locally and then submitting pull requests straight to the careers and code base repo. Of course, I'm the one, accepting the pull request. I'm doing both ends, but but yeah, so that's pretty cool. So it's, it's gone through 7 iterations. So it looks like they've done quite a bit to this thing. So, and to be honest, I really like this particular component. So cool. Any questions on this? Name of the item trip. Nice. Oh, yep.
Yeah, it's kind of hard, but then if you have a plural, then like a single item that you're adding, it's kind of difficulty with the grammar there, but.
Oh, yeah.
Place though in the project.
You'd want to do something like.
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it that if you only had one item or, yeah, I don't know.
We did it somewhere else already in this project. In search, I think.
Yeah, so you do it like this. The quantity is greater than 1.
Oh.
Right, so now if I do that, it should say 3 items, 1 item.
Right, and then you can put from item.id in the, what do you call them?
Yep, or item instead of item.
Can't remember. Turner, no, not Turner. What's the word?
The
braces with the dollar sign.
Right, so I can put item.name, right? I can say.
Or ID. Yep. Oh, I see.
Did I not say
name
that?
Would be better, yeah.
1 waterfall retreat. 2 waterfall retreats. Now, that grammatically, that may not make sense for the next thing, right? So if it does it make sense to have an ES or an S? So yeah, it gets all into like, yeah, you can have fun with that. So just things to take into account. Pluralization of things can get real tedious, like things that end in Y, right? You have to change to IES and all those sorts of things. But if you keep it simple, like item or let's say package, like these are vacation packages. Vacation. This fits my model perfectly. I've added 2 vacation packages or 1 vacation package, right? So
Okay.
keeping things generic allows you to take better advantage of pluralization patterns. Okay, cool. Let's see. The last thing we need to do is our footer. Everything else is basically complete. And let me just take a look at footer to see if it's just markup or yeah, it's all just markup in CSS. So let me show you this thing. So what we could do instead, unless you guys really want to type out all that CSS, we can start to talk about things like state and how it impacts like the entire application. Or if there's any other parts of this application that we need to go over again, you can let me know. But let me show you what this footer looks like. It's just a bunch of divs. Nothing really exciting. This is really all it is. It's all just some generic stuff. Right? There's just a generic form here that just pops open an alert. Nothing really special. So if you want, if there's other questions regarding this application, we can go over those. So I'll leave you guys a minute there to think of any questions regarding this or any other ways that you think we could enhance it. And you can grab that code from the completed folder if you want to show the footer on there. But yeah, it's just a bunch of divs. Cool. So should we get into state? Talk about that. State's pretty important, especially as your app grows. You're going to want to be able to manage your state properly. So the way we're using state is. So product detail page is a perfect example, right? So we've got use state. We got a bunch of pieces of state right here, right? But this state only exists at the level of product detail page, at this component. This is the only place it lives. It doesn't live any place higher, so I can't share it with like sibling components per se, right? I have to find ways to move the data out of here. But I really wouldn't want to do that. If I'm defining state within this component, that means that this should be the only place it lives. You shouldn't need this anywhere else except maybe in a child component, right? We shouldn't be passing this data around the entire app because if we're defining it inside the component, that's where it should have lived all along anyway. That should be the pattern, right? So we're not going to have the state of our entire application inside product detail page. It doesn't make any sense. We want to have it at a higher level if we wanted to do that. So let's say that we wanted to have I don't know. Let's say we implemented a login feature, right? And we're saving that technically we'd want that data to live on the back end, but let's just say for the sake of argument, we've got some sort of property that represents some user preference that the user made during this session. Maybe they can change the color of something or whatever, right? So while I'm thinking about a good example of that, let's go and implement or start to implement where we would keep that piece of state. So if we want a piece of state that the entire application has access to, we need to put that state at the highest possible level, right? So that everything below it can have access to it. So for us, the highest possible level is index.js, but I don't want to put that in here, right? Because that's where app is. All I want this file to do is render the app. I don't want any logic in here whatsoever, other than whether I'm using a test API or not. That's the only logic that should be in this particular file for this application. Otherwise, we need to go down into app itself. Let's go into there and say, okay, here's the app. Here's my layout. That's cool. I could wrap this thing with some sort of piece of state so that everything below it could have access to it. So let me show you one technique of doing that. And then it's going to quickly become apparent that you're not going to want to do that particular technique. But just so you may be tempted to do this for simplicity's sake, but over time it does not get simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, you guys can follow along. I'm going to import use state from React. And inside this component, let's just pretend that all of our, we'll just use a username just for simplicity's sake. You really wouldn't want to have users defined at this level, but just to show the piece of state and how it navigates down or propagates down, I think is a good example. So we'll say const user, we'll just say user name, set username equals use state. And let's just say by default, it's just put your own name in there, whatever you want. I could define state like this and say, okay, cool. I want to get username down into layout because I want that available in my layout. So cool. So I'll give it a prop and I'll say username equals username. Right? Same thing we've been doing. Excellent. Well, inside layout, let's go inside layout. Components, layout.js. All right, so now this takes props. One of those props is now props.username. So let's say I want to put the username in the header. Okay, so I could say username equals props.username. Right, I'm going to pass it down here. And so I started an app. This is where it's defined and where it's able to be changed. I'm going to pass it down with a prop. And from layout, now I have access to it for header, right? So now I can pass it down to header and say, cool. Header takes a prop called username, which comes from the parent prop.username. Let's go into header. This also takes props. And now we can say, all right, instead of showing this R and R, let's show props.username. We'll show our name. So now if I look at my app, there's my name up here. Right, so it started at the top, made its way down into layout, then made its way down into header, and now I'm actually displaying it here. Like, well, that's cool. Let's say that this component was 10 levels deep. What would I have to do to get that prop all the way down to each level? Every single component along the way has to take a username prop. Can you start to see why that's probably not a good idea? What happens if, let's say, the fifth level component that's at the fifth level down, let's say you forgot to add that prop. Like, where's my username? Well, guess what? Now you got to drill through every single component to find out where you missed it. Doesn't sound like a good time, right? So that technique is called prop drilling. You're literally drilling the props all the way down through the component tree. If you find yourself needing to pass a prop more than 1, maybe 2 levels deep, it's time to start rethinking about that prop. Okay, because at that point, it's only going to get confusing. You're only going to introduce bugs at some point, right? Maybe someone that's co-developing with you on your project or on your team doesn't know that you added that prop and they completed this whole thing and they pushed it to production. And you're like, oh my God, where's all my props, right? Like nothing's working right. It's really hard to document because now you have to, let's say that one particular component, you don't want to use it in that tree anymore. So now you have to reorganize every other component surrounding it to make sure that the prop gets down to the right one. It's just not a good idea. It's technically, you can accomplish things like this, but it's really not a best practice, like for the reasons I just mentioned. It's confusing, it gets complex. It's just hard to navigate. You can introduce all kinds of bugs. So we're going to get rid of that idea and restore. We're not going to pass props to header or username to header. We're not even going to do this. We're not going to do that. In fact, what we're going to do is something a little different. We're going to implement what's called global state. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to do that. One way would be to import a library that does it for you, like Redux. Redux is a state management library that manages the global state for whichever portion of your application needs global state. And what it does is it's basically a single source of truth for this data that any of your components in your application can access, as long as they are somewhere down the tree. We're not going to import Redux right now. We may get to it later, or maybe tomorrow if there's enough interest in it. But Redux does get complex. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a pattern that you can use without any libraries other than React. And we can implement something that's very, very, very similar and just as useful. And for small to medium-sized applications, this pattern that I'll show you is perfectly acceptable, and it's pretty maintainable as long as you don't get too crazy with it. So we're going to implement global state, and what we're going to do is we're going to explore a concept called context. So React context is a way that you can get around the whole prop drilling phenomenon, that whole pattern. It allows any component that has access to context to access the values within that context. So it kind of wraps a portion of your component tree with this kind of like pipeline that you can tap into at any point along the way. You can think of it like a bunch of power strips connected together, where at each point there's more like plugs that you can plug things into. That's kind of like context. So as long as your component has the right plug, you can access that context. But before we do that, we're going to need to go over to the React's official docs to get a look at what this looks like. We go to docs, under main concepts, probably advanced guides. Yeah, context right here. So reactjs.org, go to docs and then context. And right here it says context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. This is the thing that we wanted to solve, right? We don't want to be prop drilling all over the place. It's just painful. So I kind of already went over when to use context. Let's see what they say about before. Yeah, they're just talking about prop drilling. That's cool. All right, so we're going to be introduced to just some new things that are available to us. All right, I'm going to get rid of this zoom control. And we'll start with creating a file that's going to hold the value of our context. So it's not, well, we're going to put it in, let's see, should we put it in components? There's components associated with it. So yeah, we'll just do that for simplicity's sake. So inside your components folder, create a new folder. We'll call this app context. And we'll create a new file called app context.js. And we're going to need to import some stuff. We need to import, let's see, create context. We're going to need that. I'm going to import that from React. That's the first thing we'll import. We'll start there. We'll keep it simple at first. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to create this context object that's going to hold all of our data. And it doesn't always have to be an object. It could be an array. It could be any sorts of things. Objects are easy for global state because they're really easy to think about it, right? So you have your state object, and there's properties on that object that you can store values at. So like state.username or state.theme color or something, right? So using objects for your context is probably the simplest way to go. I mean, it's the easiest way to think about your global state. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of different contexts if you want like strings or that are separate and things like that. Similar with using state. You can use state as just a string. So when you set state, you can just update a single string, or you can update an object. It can be more complex. And the more complex your app gets, the more you're going to want to use objects because they're a lot easier in the long run. And they're easier to modify and update and change around. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say const app context equals create context, not context. And we're going to pass it an empty object. The same way that you, with use state, where you say use state and you pass it this default thing, that's the default value of our context. So now that we've created a context, we have access to two different things. And those things are going to be how we actually provide and access the values within our context object throughout our application. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll say const app context provider. That's going to be equal to app context, context dot provider. Let's see. Well, actually, let's do this. Instead of app context, let's just say context. Let's to make it easier down the road, and you'll kind of see why. So I'm just going to rename that like that. And then I'm going to say const app context consumer equals context.consumer. Given just, given just these names, you kind of get a sense of what each of these things does, right? So the provider is the thing that provides access to the data, access to the values. The consumer is literally that. It's the consumer of those values. Yeah. So now we can create our app context kind of wrapper that's going to wrap our entire application. We're going to export const app context. We'll just say, let's see. Let's call this our store. Let's do that. So because this, if we think about, this will make it easier in the long run too. So if we think about data in a store, you can kind of conceptualize what store represents, right? It's a single place where you have access to a myriad of different things, right? So when you go to a physical store, there's things you can consume there, right? You purchase them, you consume them. So if we think about our data the same way, And we call this our store. Let's call it our app store. And that will be that's going to be a component. I'm going to return some markup, but not just any markup. We're going to return our app context provider, like that. This takes props. And a very important prop. Inside our app context provider tags, we want to render props.children. This is important because if we need to wrap our entire application with our new store, then all the things that need access to that data have to be a child of that store. So we have to be able to render any possible children, which in this point, props.children will represent our entire application, or at least from app down. So now any children that happen to have access via this consumer that we'll get to, now we can actually access that data properly. But there's one more thing we have to do for our store. Now we've provided this default value, which doesn't do much for us, right? We need to update, we need to provide other details in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const initial store equals some object. And we'll say username. You could plug your name in there. And then we're going to take over here on our app context provider. This has a prop called value. Yep. And that's going to be our initial store. This may look a little confusing at first, but just kind of go along here. So our provider takes a value, and that value is equal to initially to this. That's what's initially set to some object. Now you may be thinking, well, what about this over here? Technically, we could do that up here, right? But over time, that's not going to be sustainable, because we're going to need to update that thing. We need to have a way to update the store too. If we can access data in our store, let's say the username changes. Well, we want to be able to change that somewhere down the road, and we want to define every value of our store right here as a default value. The same way when we use state, we can update it. There's an updater function to update use state, right? So in that same sort of thinking, this is just the initial kind of like, hey, this is going to be an object. This is more of like a pointer to someone developing with you. Say, well, okay, this particular context holds an object. That's cool. I would expect that the value should be an object, right? It's at some place, somewhere in this file we should have, or maybe the initial store is defined in another file and we're importing it, right? This should just be kind of like a guideline onto what type of data shape is going to be in here. So now we have our provider with our initial value, which is this object right here. And this all lives in our component called App Store. So let's save that. And for now, we're just going to go over to app. We'll import it. So import App Store from, let's see, we need to go, nope, we need to go into components. So /components / app context / app context. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, why don't we call this App Store? You'd probably want to do that just so that you know what you're importing. But that's okay for now. This is just for example purposes. So, all right, cool. So now we have our App Store. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything within our anything within our div, so the layout, we're going to wrap that with App Store. If you remember, App Store takes children, layout, and all of its components down the component tree will now be children of App Store. So now they'll have access to that data as long as we are able to plug into it with our consumer. Now I'm going to show you two ways to use consumer. One is the quote unquote traditional way. We'll do that one first. The second one will be the React hooks way, which after seeing the traditional way, you're going to always want to use the hooks way. But showing you the traditional way is important because you need to understand how this whole thing came about and why the hooks was even created for it in the first place. Why is the hooks so great? Well, we're about to see why. There's a lot of benefits to using function components. All right, so, which is another reason why the traditional way existed first, because it came before hooks was even a thing, before function components could hold quote unquote state. So, all right. Does everyone have this right now? Our app is not going to look any different, right? Just because it's inside, it's wrapped around this app store, it's not going to render any differently. We want to make sure we are rendering it. Otherwise, we've got a problem. Otherwise, we messed up along the way. But as long as we see our app, we're good. We're just not accessing any data in the context yet. Cool. So we can close app.js now. We're done. We don't need to do anything else in app.js. We've wrapped our layout with our app store. We're good to go. Now inside, let's go back to header, right? Let's say we want to replace this with our username. Well, we look at app context. We're exporting this thing called app context, or we're not exporting it yet, but there's this thing called app context consumer. Now what we could do is we could export something that's better named. We'll just say app. We'll just say this. We'll call it app store consumer. And we'll set that equal to context.consumer. In fact, we don't even need this at all. We just, sorry, export const. So now we have all of our exports down here. So we're exporting our app store, which we're already using. And we're exporting this app store consumer, which is the plug, essentially, that plugs into our app store. We'll save that. All right, and then we'll head over to header. We're going to import that app store consumer. Import app store consumer from, got to go up one. There's my autocomplete. Why am I autocomplete? App context. App context. Well, that should be. Yep. Okay. All right. So we went up a directory because we're inside components, right? So we're in our header. So we go up one to this level into app context and grab our stuff out of app context. So now how do we get username out of this app context thing? Well, app store consumer is a component. So what we're going to do is we're, instead of R&R, we're going to say app store consumer. and it needs an open and closing tag. And inside here, this is where it gets fun. App Store consumer takes a child, and that child is a function. So it's going to look like this. And that function renders markup the same way we're rendering markup here. So I could say, we'll just put it in, yeah, we'll put it in a span because we're already inside the link. So we can render a span. And let's just do R and R just to make sure this thing renders. I'll save that. It's going to reformat everything on me. Everything's still rendering, so we're good, right? And just to verify that, I'll add some exclamation points. Okay, cool. I haven't broken anything, but nothing's really changed. All I'm doing is rendering this function looking thing, right? Well, what this function does, as its primary argument that gets passed, you get passed your store or the context. We're just calling it store. This represents the object that is stored right here. So now I could say, well, what's on this store object? Store.username is on that object, right? Now, if I look over here, there's my username. Right, so this pattern that we're seeing where the child is a function, that's called the render props pattern. And essentially what it does is whatever you pass to this function, you now have access to in the thing that it returns, right? And in this case, we want to return markup. We want to return some JSX markup that becomes DOM nodes. And now I have access to the store right here.
Joey, can you go? Yeah. Oh, we're looking at chat.
Let's see. App Store, nothing was returned from render. This usually means return statement is missing. Or render nothing, return null. So I haven't seen that error in a long time. Let's do this. Let me copy. Just, you know, you're going to have a username of Joey, but I'll copy app context.js. Make sure everything's good there. So that we're on the same page. You may have not set the value properly or something like that. And then app.js. Where's app.js? I'll copy app.js in there as well. That way everyone can follow along with that. So if you copy paste those in there, you should be good, at least from the store and the app.js point of view. Oh, we can get rid of this use state. This is completely useless now. But that's okay. It's not going to affect the application anyway. Let's see. And then now all you have to do is import this and call it like this. So I'll leave this on the screen for a little bit while I talk about it. That way you can kind of catch up. All right, so our app store consumer is our plug that plugs into the store that app store is providing for us at the top of our application tree. Underneath the hood, React is saying, okay, I know that this thing is intrinsically connected to that object that you defined in your context file, right? So I'm going to allow you to pass me a child, and that child has to be a function. And the primary thing I'm going to give that function is the value that I'm holding in my store. That's why I'm calling it store, to make it very apparent that this is my store object. right? In fact, we could even take it one step further. If we could say store object, it should be really clear what this thing is, right? And context will always pass whatever that thing is. You can define it as an object, you can define it as an array, whatever it is, that is your store. Does that make sense? And this is just using a function. This is just a pattern that was developed just because it made sense at the time. Right. So then on that object, there can be other things and not just username, right? If I go back to here, I could say theme, we'll say light. You're on the light theme. Is using store object dot theme. Joe is using light theme, right? So now I have access to all that data that's in my store. And your store can get pretty complex. But the nice thing about having it like right here in one place is that now you can manage it better. There's only one place to manage it. You don't have to manage it in all the different components. You don't have to worry about passing props down everywhere, right? I'll put this back up. Now you can manage one object in one place instead of many things in many places. And it greatly simplifies, even though this may look a little complex, it greatly simplifies how the data flows in your application. One of those libraries, like I mentioned, Redux, that whole library is dedicated to managing state. And it does a really, really good job of it. It's a little bit more complex than this. For someone that has never used it before, it would be a lot more complex. But after a while, you realize it's really not much different than what we're doing here. It just provides greater functionality right out of the box, instead of you having to write everything yourself. So what we're doing is we're creating essentially a mini version of a state management component library, except we're doing it only with React. We're not importing anything at all. We're just using whatever React gives us, which is right now the create context function. Is this all making sense, conceptually at least? I see some head nods. Yeah, so state, like I said, state can get complex. But I really wanted to introduce you to these things so that if you get hired on at a place that uses state management tools like this, these patterns, you'll recognize the pattern at least. And it won't be foreign to you. And feel free to rewatch this video as many times as you want, especially if you don't get it right away. Eventually, after using it over and over, it'll start to sink in, just like with anything else. It's just practice, practice, practice. But the concept is extremely important to understand more than the execution of it, right? Why do we need this? Why would we want to do this? And the reason is because we want to avoid all those buggy patterns that existed before this thing even happened, right? To have a central location for all of your data makes sense. Now, the nice thing about context is that you can have different contexts for different parts of your application. So let's say at the top level, let's say, for example, if we go to layout, for each one of these routes, I could create a new context for each one of those. And each one of those will have values that are only applicable for that route and below, right? I can do that. Or like what we're doing here, we have one context for the entire application, right? So you can pick and choose at which level this context could live that holds that sort of complex state that you need to manage across that component, that part of the component tree. So a really powerful tool. As soon as, in fact, as soon as context came out, like officially was like, wasn't in like beta anymore, and it was no longer buggy, I created a component library that is a state management component library, which they still use over at Raymore and Flanagan. It's called React Quick Store. It's the quickest way to get a store up that uses this context without actually having to do all the boilerplate yourself. And it even has like asynchronous functionality to it. So you can write API calls, get data back, update your store. Because doing asynchronous stuff with this can get a little complex. That's another reason why tools like Redux exists. They provide functionality for tapping into the asynchrony portion of state management, the same way that I did it for React Quick Store, that uses both a synchronous and asynchronous type of method for updating data. For now, we're just going to talk about the synchronous stuff. And then if there's enough interest in it, I can tap into the asynchronous stuff a little later. But I want to get at least the synchronous stuff part down first. My grammar was terrible there. The asynchronous part or synchronous part down first, so that we can, explore other things later. Because getting the synchronous part is important as well. And the synchronous part of this is literally, hey, I have this data, which is shared to the entire application via this store and all of its children. And I access it with this consumer component. I pass it a function, and that function gets passed that value in context, that stored object. And now I have access to all the properties on it. And you notice I'm doing it here. The rest of this component over here doesn't have access to it, right? Wherever I defined this, you can even be targeted on where you're consuming that stuff. I only wanted to do it here. But what if I wanted this entire component to have access to that? Well, how would I do that? I'm going to get rid of this. Actually, let me just cut this. I'll put it in a comment below in case people still need access to that. What if I'm going to say, I still want to have access to username here. For now, I'm just going to put username as a reminder that, hey, this is where I want access to username. So how do I do this entire component? Well, I do it basically the same way that I did it before, except App Store Consumer is going to wrap the entire thing. But if you remember, oh, it's not rendering anything. Why? Well, the child of a consumer has to be a function. So, remember, I have my store. That goes to everything. Rendering again, that's good. Now let's see if I have access to username. Store.user. Okay. There it is. But this looks confusing at first, right? You're like, okay, I got this thing. It's inside here. What if I want a different context way down here? I got to do the same pattern, and it has to be a function, and that function has to return markup. And as cool as this is, you can kind of get, remember callback hell, where everything starts to go to the right? You start to this giant pyramid of callbacks. Well, you can have a giant pyramid of different contexts too. And that can just get really unwieldy, right? So which context is this data coming from, and which one is this using, and which one am I updating? They can get really, really complex as your component grows in complexity. So there's another way we can access the store without using a component. So let's do that. Let's get rid of this. So now we just have, well, this isn't going to render, right? It's going to tell me, oh, I can't do this because this is no longer valid. So we'll put this as a placeholder again. So at least our application renders. There we go. There's a hook we can use to gain access to our store. The same way that we can use hooks for grabbing access to, use state. It's very, very similar. So up here, we're going to import something called use context. Again, all hooks start with use. That's the convention. So if you create your own hooks down the road, just prepend the word use in front of it so you know exactly what the intent is there. And what use context does is it takes, I'll just say export const, we'll say use app store. That's going to be our own custom hook. So we're actually going to write a custom hook, but it's going to be really, really simple. And that's going to be equal to a function. And that function is going to return use context. That's also a function. These hooks are functions. And that's going to take our context object. I'll leave this like this so you guys can follow along here. So in app context.js, oh, sorry, we need to make sure, let me just close this. So everything's on the screen. There we go. Import use context from React. Create this function called use app store. And we're going to return whatever use context with the context object passed in, whatever that returns to us. That's what we're going to use. And this may feel a little confusing right now. And we can walk through it again if there's questions. But the next part, hopefully, will make you smile. It's going to look a lot nicer than wrapping things with app store consumer and passing functions. And if you forget to pass the function, nothing renders. And so we'll go back over to header.js. And instead of importing app store consumer, we're going to import use app store. Inside our function, we're going to say const store equals use app store. We're going to call it just like that. Anyone want to take a guess what this variable now holds? Let's go down here. Let's see what it's in it. Store.use. Maybe it's our store. Oops. Oh, that's not it. Store.username. Let's see what happens. I have access to my entire store with one line of code. The entire thing. Now I can access any property off that store anywhere without having to wrap it in functions and components and anything like that. Looks a lot nicer, right? Conceptually, it makes more sense, right? You could say, hey, this variable holds my store because this says so. It says I'm using the app store. It's right here. I have access to all the properties on it. Right, so this is far easier conceptually to deal with, working with state inside your application. Now, the reason the other pattern existed is because, hooks didn't exist yet. Function components did not hold state. It was all done in class components. So the thinking was at the time, well, since class components are the ones that hold state, we're going to cater to those. And function components they just view things, right? Right. So you can just wrap this function with the store thing. You could just use that. But it quickly became apparent that gets really unwieldy. So when hooks came out, they were like, all right, let's investigate all the different patterns that we want to improve upon. So of course, use state came along. So you can use pieces of state inside your function components, use effect, so we can have access to lifecycle methods like our class components have access to, when it mounts, when it updates, when it unmounts, all those things. And then they said, well, what else can we wrap? What else can we make out of a hook? Context sounds like a good idea, because we don't want to write all those functions inside consumer tags all over the place. That gets terrible. So one line of code gives us access to the entire store. Done. Now I can access any property on it. Function components are basically like, it's just the way to go. There's only one reason to use a class component now, and that's for adding what's called error boundaries. And it allows you to capture exceptions in your React code and not have the entire application disappear on you. You can gracefully handle errors in your React component. So if some reason the header threw an exception, right? Because maybe I was accessing a property that didn't exist or whatever, right? Or maybe I didn't use this line of code properly, and maybe I said store, right? Now store.username doesn't work anymore because this is no longer named the same. That sort of exception, you can catch that in an error boundary, and you can handle it gracefully. You can say, oh, there's an error in this part of the application. Instead of rendering a blank screen, I'm going to render another component that says, hey, I noticed there was something wrong. Contact your local developer or whatever, right? But if there's an exception in a React application, React's first instinct is to say, okay, I'm not going to display anything. It's better to display nothing than a bunch of gobbledygook, right? So that was the thinking, right? And then inside your developer console, you would see errors in there. So your typical end user that doesn't know dev consoles exist would never see the errors. And they'd be like, oh, okay, they don't have to worry about all this messy stuff. But the developers would say, oh, nothing's rendering. Better go to my console, see what's going on, right? So that was the thinking there. At least I'm pretty sure that was the thinking. That's the way I like to think about it. Yeah, so creating an error boundary, we can get to that maybe tomorrow. But I want to dedicate the rest of today to talking about how we can utilize state better. Any questions so far on what we just went over with creating context and creating our own hook to access it? Now, actually, before any questions, let me show one more thing. We don't have to export our own custom hook to do this. Instead, what we could do is we could export this context object. And inside header, instead of doing this, let me just comment that out. I could import use context from React. Oh, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to do it here. Should never have two import statements from the same source. If you have more than one thing, you should always put it on the same import statement. Cause conflicts. Yeah, so we're going to import use context the same way we're doing it up here, except now, now instead of importing just use app store, we can import that context object. And now I can say, okay, const store equals use context, right? Everything still renders, right? Except now I'm importing two different things. I'm importing React's use context, and I'm importing my context object reference, and I'm combining them here. But in reality, like, I'm doing the same thing with use app store, except I don't need to import all those extra things. And this looks a heck of a lot cleaner, right? I only have to worry about one thing being imported instead of multiple things. Does that make sense? So that's just something that I particularly do. I don't know if anyone else really does that. When I was creating the React Quick Store component, it just made sense to me because I didn't want to tell people to import their context object along with this other stuff. And I just wanted to be as the quickest possible way to get a store going, right? Use store. In fact, I export it as use store. That's it. Or use quick store, something like that. Right. And so that all you have to do is import that one thing and you're good to go, as long as you're wrapping, your entire application with your provider. What questions you guys have on context and state thus far? I'm sure there's some. Or if not, if you think of something over the break, we'll take a break in a couple minutes. We're at a good point. And then what we'll do when we come back from break is we'll provide a way to update the store from anywhere in your application. So not only are we able to read the stuff, but we can also update it as well. Right, so if your user clicks on some button down here, it could, I don't know, change some piece of state somewhere. Right, maybe they changed the theme, or maybe you're holding all of your cart items in global state. You want to add something to the cart, you need to be able to add things that way, or whatever the thing could be. To keep things simple, we'll just change our username or something like that, just to show you the pattern. And then you can apply that pattern to any piece of data. Sound good? All right, so let's take a break. We'll say, let's come back at 7:20. I'll give you guys some extra time to grab a bite to eat, or think of any questions, like if you need to mill over the questions in your head, kind of flush them out before you ask them, feel free to do that. And then we'll see y'all back at 7:20. Oh, we got 1 more minute, so is your 1 minute warning?
That worked out perfectly. I was able to go back and watch the part that I missed when I was having problems with my application during the break. So now I understand what you're talking about more.
Oh, cool. Good timing.
So I missed the first part and I only saw the second version of it with the use context. So it makes more sense after seeing the first part.
Yeah, it helps. All right, so I'm gonna give everyone about 30 more seconds. Okay. So before the break, we implemented some quote unquote global state using React context. And so far, all we're doing is accessing properties on that context, which happens to be an object we're calling the store object. So what if we want to make changes to that object in response to user interactions? Well, we need a way to tap into the ability to update that thing. So in order to do that, we're going to explore another hook that React provides to us. And we're just going to create a brand new store because it's going to be easier than modifying the one we've got going on now. So I'm just kind of going to reverse engineer what we just did. So I'm still going to keep this as username over here in the header.js file. I'm going to get rid of this statement and this one. So it's just back to how it would have been normally, other than the word username being there. So if you want to follow along, feel free to do that. We just basically want to remove all instances of our previous quote unquote store. We're going to create a brand new store, and we're going to do it using similar approach, but it's going to be more powerful. We're going to build upon what we just learned. So here, we're going to get rid of this. Bring it back to how our app.js looked in the first place. And that's really all we need to do to revert our app back to not using global state. Now we just have this text up here, which all it does is it takes us back to the home page, just like what it's always been doing. Right, so cool. We're still going to implement some functionality into each of these files, but we're going to kind of ignore this app context folder right now. So close that down. Now inside your source folder, you should create a new folder at the source level. We're going to call that folder store. This is going to house all the data for our store that we're going to re-implement with greater functionality. And folder and file structure naming here, this is more in line with what you'll typically see. You'll see your components folder. You'll see if there's data, you'll see something related to your store. If someone's using Redux, they may call this folder Redux, right? Or call it store or app store or something, right? It's usually separate from your components. So it's a separate concept. The reason I put this in here is because literally it's opening, closing tags, the old way of doing context. So inside our store, we'll create a new file called store.js. Actually, we're going to do capital store JS. It doesn't really matter. In fact, kind of does. Let's make this a lowercase because we're going to be exporting a couple different things out of here. But as long as this name's store, you import it from the right place, you'll be fine. Okay, so what do we need in here? Well, we're going to need some similar stuff. We're still going to use context underneath the hood, but we're going to import one additional thing in addition to that. So we're going to import, we had create context, right? We had use context. We're going to import something called use reducer. I'll go over the concept of what a reducer is. Remember, arrays, they have a function available called reduce. You start thinking about that sort of concept. You've got a bunch of different things that you kind of merge down into one thing. That's going to be in line with what a reducer is used for. It's no coincidence that it's got a similar name. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we need to create a context object that's going to hold our data. So we'll say const, we're going to call it store context equals create context. And we're not going to pass it an object this time. Remember what I said? The default value is kind of like a hint at what the state or what the shape of your store is going to look like. So we're going to pass it a shape that's going to make more sense. It's going to make more sense later as we work through this, but it's going to tell us what the shape of our store's value is. That before it was just an object, the thing we passed to the provider value equals that initial store. This initial shape is going to show us what our new thing is going to be. It's going to be an array, and it's going to be an array of two things. The first thing's an object, and the second thing's a function. Where have we seen an array where the first thing is an object, or the first thing is a value and the second thing is a function? Where have we seen that before? Oh, my chat's closed. People are probably saying this. Do not use effect. The other thing. Yeah, it's a hook. You've got the hook part. Const an array of two things equals use. Use state, you got it. Right, so we've seen this pattern before, right? So we're going to stick with that pattern. We're going to be consistent from now on. The reason I was showing you the other thing was for simplicity's sake. Now we actually want to stay consistent with the patterns we also see around React. So our context, our store context will be this array where the first thing will be some value, will be an object of values. And the second thing is going to be a function. And that function that we eventually define is going to allow us to have our child components be able to update our store. That's the function we're going to give them so they can make updates. The same way use state gives us that updater function, we're going to give our components an updater function so they can access they can update the global state. So what do we need first? Well, we need some piece of initial state. So we'll say const initial state equals some object. And we'll just put in, let's see, the username. We'll keep that blank for now. We'll just say default username, right? Just so that we can clearly see when the values change. And maybe we'll do, well, we'll start with that and then we can expand as we go. we've got that. Sorry, I'm just reorganizing all my windows over here. Let's see. What else do we need? Well, we need a store, right? So the same way we had our provider before, we're going to need a provider now. So we're going to export const store capital, because this is going to be our provider component. So we want it to be capitalized, equals a function. And that's going to take props. And what this will return, we're going to need, sorry, our store context dot provider, because remember that's the provider gives us, I'm sorry, the context object gives us a provider and a consumer, right? So here we have our provider. We're going to give it a value of an array, right? Because this is the shape we want to go for. The first thing, we'll start with our initial state. And then we'll just do an empty function. It's called a no operation function, just as a placeholder for now. So we can verify that we can access our data. Once we verify that our store is working for accessing it, we'll work on modifying it properly so we can update it as well. But we basically want to get to the same state we were before, where we could access our username property. And then of course, in here, we have props.children. So we have a proper wrapper component that we can wrap our entire application with. The second thing we want to export const use store. Just like we had use app store, we're just going to call this use store because we're calling it store. And that's going to be equal to a function that returns our use context hook. We're going to pass in our store context. Same thing we were doing before, except now it's just an implicit return instead of the explicit one. Okay, so our sole purpose right now is to make sure we can access username in header.js. So the first thing we need to do is wrap our app with our store. So let's go to app.js, import store from ./store/store. And then we're going to wrap that store component around our layout component. At this point, we should still be rendering. We should have no problems right now. So if it's not rendering, there's a problem. All right. So now inside of, let me just move this over to the left so I'm organized. Look for store to app.js, which technically we're done with. We don't really need to do anything else with this right now. So we can actually close this. We're done. In header, now we're going to import use store from .. So we should be, why is my I don't know why my autocomplete's not working in this file. That's weird. I wonder if it's because of this. Sorry, I'm just baffled. Well, anyway, so I'm in header. So I got to go up one. Now I'm in the components folder. I got to go up another. Then I go down into store/store. So I got to make sure I got the right relative path. Okay, cool. So now what I'm going to do is, oh, we have our use store. So let's do the same thing down here. We got const store equals use store. Same thing as before. Now let's make sure that we have access to store.username. So when I hit save, I should see this change to default username. And it doesn't. Any guesses why? We did the same thing we did before, but we changed. What did we change? We changed the shape of our store. Right, so what we're getting back is an array. And the first thing in that array is our store. So now if I save it, voila, right? So something to pay attention to, right? So if the first time you're using this thing is like, why can't I access this? Look at the shape you're getting, right? Here's the shape that we're getting. So just something to pay attention to. But the nice thing about this is that if I were to import, use state from React, name set name equals use state, Joey. Like this would be whatever function that updates it. I wouldn't call it set store because that's not what I'm really doing. There's another name we're going to use here, but you can see that this pattern, now it flows perfectly with everything else. So we're going to leave that like that. I'm going to get rid of this because that's just for illustration purposes. But we're using the same pattern that React uses, so we're cool. All right. At least now when we think about store, we're thinking about it as state, the same way we've been thinking about it. So let's go back to our store and let's update this thing so we can actually provide functionality to our components so they can update the store. Not everything is hard-coded forever anymore. All right, so we're going to use this concept of a reducer. And just like I was explaining with array.reduce, this reducer takes, well, it could take a bunch of different other reducers, and it smashes them all down into one final value that it spits back out. That's the purpose of it, right? It takes, it looks at a whole bunch of different conditional logic that we give it. It says, well, based on this or this, what should I return or what should I update and eventually return? So this thing's going to handle all of the updating of our state object. And we're going to bake into it the functionality that our app needs specifically in order to update our specific store. Because not every store is the same, right? So your application does not have the same data or even the same shape of data as the next person's, right? So this part's custom. It has to be because it's catered to your app, but the pattern is pretty universal. Okay, so what are we going to do? We are going to first talk about what we need to pass to our use reducer hook, right? Because hooks are functions and it will take a couple different arguments. And so what we'll do is inside our component, we're going to say const, and again, it has the syntax. The first thing it gives us back is our state. The second thing it gives us back is something called dispatch. I'll explain that in a second. So we'll say equals use reducer, and we need to pass it two things. We need to pass it the actual reducer that's going to have all the logic. So before we complete this, let's create that thing. So above here, we'll say const reducer equals, and this is a function. A reducer takes two arguments. The first one is state, and the second one is called action. I'll get to that in just a second. And for now, we're just going to return the state. We're not going to do anything special just yet. We're just going to return whatever current state is. That's all we want to do at this point. So now that's the first thing we pass to our use reducer. The second thing we pass is the initial value of state. Well, we have that already. It's right here. Initial state. So we're going to move that up here. So our initial state no longer needs to be passed to the value directly. We're going to pass the initial state to this reducer thing. And that's the thing that's going to actually handle all of the updates and the returning of the values for us. That's where the power comes in, the power logic thing. Logic power, I don't know. That's the powerhouse of our little factory here. Let's see. So now we've got state. So use reducer gives us back the state we want to give to our users. So let's take state and move that down here. And we'll take dispatch and we'll put that here. This is the function that allows state to eventually be updated. This is what we're going to give our users. Well, our users being our components. This is what we're going to give our components, that function that allows us to do that updating of state. So what is all this stuff? What is dispatch? What is action? What is all this stuff? Well, if you think about the name dispatch, right? So if you're, let's say you work at an HVAC company, right? And you have a bunch of technicians, right? And there's a problem with some company, their AC is broken. What do? Well, you take a call, right? And say, okay, I'll dispatch a technician to go fix it for you, right? You're dispatching something or someone. Same concept here. Our components will dispatch what's called an action. And that action holds all the data of what type of update needs to happen. It probably holds the data of the actual data that needs to make it into your state. Right? It may or may not, depending on the type of action it is, the type of thing you want to happen. But that action is basically, let's go back to our HVAC company example, right? You dispatch a technician and you give that technician a list of his responsibilities when he gets on site. You give him an action to do. That action holds all the necessary information in order for him to complete his job and return back to you and say, okay, job's complete. We can update our books. So updating of state is like the updating of the books, right? So we did this thing, we can bill the customer, we can get paid, we can go home and feed our families, right? So if you think about it that way, you're dispatching an action, you're dispatching something that needs to happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's just an intent of something to happen. And then this reducer is kind of like the actual technician doing the work, fixing the stuff and coming back and saying, hey, it's complete. Here's my report for the day, right? Does that concept make sense? And the reason I'm pulling that HVAC company thing out is because my wife actually is a dispatcher. That's what she does for a living. She tells people to go do stuff. So it's actually kind of, but it's a perfect analogy, right? Because this is the thing that you go and dispatch out, they go do the work, they come back, they give you back your new piece of state, which is the new state of your business, right? Great analogy. So just actually kind of perfect. So cool. So we're going to dispatch actions, or the components are going to dispatch actions, and our reducer is going to handle that action and decide what should happen in our state. So what should happen in our state? Well, what do we have now? We have a header.js file that all it's doing is displaying its username, right? But let's say that, let's put a button right after this thing. And we'll say log out. User clicks this button, they've logged out. So on click equals, some function, right? Something in here. Something in here we need to do. Well, we have access to that second element in that array that we get back from useStore, which is our dispatch function. Cool, we can dispatch what's called an action. So now inside our function, we'll say dispatch. And what we provide dispatch is the actual action that we want to make it back to our store. But what does an action look like? Well, there's a couple different parts. It's an object, right? So we know it's an object, first of all. And this is a very convenient data model. And it's a pretty widely accepted convention as well. So we dispatch an object. That object is our action. The action has properties on it. The first property is called a type. What type of action is this thing? So I'm going to say update username. When I log out, I'm going to update the username, and it's going to say, nothing or no one or whatever. Okay, no one's logged in. The other thing it takes is what's called a payload. And the payload is the data that gets transferred back to state or could possibly be transferred back to state. So every action has a type and has some sort of payload. Now, whether you call it payload or you call it data, it's the same thing. It's the data you're getting back. The convention is typically payload. That's what you'll see it most often called. And our payload is the data we want to send back. Well, in this case, when we log out, let's just say we want to pass in a string of, we'll just say logged out, right? So we won't see a username anymore. Now we'll just see this text called logged out. Simplicity's sake. Right, so here we click this button. We're going to dispatch an action. Type is update username. Payload is logged out. Cool. Let's go to our app. Let's click log out. Anyone want to take a guess what they're going to see? This is a trick question, sorry. I'm going to click it. I don't see anything. What's going on? Well, we dispatched an action, right? That's going to make its way back to the reducer. Do we see anything in here remotely related to updating a username? We don't, right? We have to tell it what actions to listen to. So the reducer needs to know what actions could possibly exist. Otherwise, it's just going to say, oh, all right, an action came through. I don't know what to do with this thing. I'm just going to return state. So I return the same state of my store, the same as it was before. So we have to put some logic in here to say, okay, for every incoming action, we need to determine what we want to do with it. Now, the generally accepted practice is to use a switch statement. Did you guys go over switch statements in JavaScript? Okay. Think of it like if, else, and else if, but like a whole bunch of else ifs, like a whole bunch, right? Or a whole bunch of else's. So what we do is, this is the syntax. The switch is a function that takes as its primary argument, we're going to pass it in the action coming in. But the primary argument to switch is what we want to evaluate. The same thing if you were to say if action, right? So we want to do some sort of conditional logic. We're going to do conditional logic on this action that came in. We're going to, for each switch, we give it a different case, a different result. Case, and then we tell it that the thing we want to evaluate against to see if it matches this case. So we don't want to just switch on action. Well, there's two different properties on actions. There's type and there's payload. We want to switch on the type. We want to know what type, first of all, this action coming in, what type of action is it? That's what we want to know first. So we'll say switch on action.type. And in the case of that type equaling update username, we're going to do some stuff. And then we can put all the code related to that here. If not, we'll move on to a different case, whatever they happen to be. Or at the final result, we could say, well, it didn't match any cases, so this will be my default case. So by default, I'll do this thing. In which case, for us, we'll just return the state. The default case is if this action.type doesn't match any of these case statements, we're just going to return state as is, right? Didn't match anything. We don't want to throw an exception. You could say, well, you could be that strict about your case statements. Well, you didn't put the right case statement in, you got an exception, right? You could be that strict. Or we could just say, didn't match anything, let it pass. We're not going to do anything about it. All right, so in the case of update username, well, we got a match, right? We're sending it or dispatching an action of type update username. Cool. That's awesome. Let's do something with that. So with every case, we're going to return what we want to happen in our state object. So basically, after every case, you're going to return your new state object, however that's supposed to look. So let's just do this. Return. For now, we'll just return an object because that's what our state is. It's an object. But what do we need to do? We need to update username, right? Username is now going to be equal to something else. Remember, our action coming in has another property called payload. So I'm going to say action.payload. What is the value of action.payload? Whatever I pass in here. So now that this action object's coming in, I can say, okay, let's switch on the type. Oh, I see we have a match. Cool. We're going to update our username with whatever the value of action.payload is. We'll save that. Let's come back over here. Let's click the button. We updated state. Perfect. We did what you can't do with prop drilling, which means you can't send data back up. So what we did is we said, okay, we bypassed that whole pipeline, right? We plugged into the store and said, hey, I have this action here. Here's the payload. You might want to go do something with that. And then, oops. And then the store says, okay, cool. Hey, I know what to do with that. I have a case statement for it. I'm going to update the username, and I'm going to return this object with the username, which completely replaces the thing up here. And now I have a new version of state. Does that make sense? And what happens, just to kind of finish the thought here, useReducer has now updated state. Well, if we think back to the useState hook, every time that piece of state gets updated, the component re-renders. So what's going to happen here is the same thing. It's going to say, hey, this piece of state updated. So the store component's going to say, oh, cool, there's an update. I'm going to re-render. So it's going to say, hey, provider, this is your new world view of state. Here's the new value. Do with it what you want. And it says, oh, well, I'm going to re-render. That means everything in my child tree needs to re-render as well. Headers happens to be one of those components in the component child tree. And it says, hey, my component's re-rendering. Cool. I'm going to grab the store because I'm re-rendering, and I'm going to render out the new value of this. Is that flow? Does that make sense? Right? Anytime a hook returns a new value, that component it's in will re-render. And since our store is a component, it will re-render. All of its children will re-render. And all of our data will pass down, all the new data will pass down into the app and render appropriately. Let's do one more, let's go one step further. And this is going to illustrate a very, very important point as well. Let's say we've got another button here that, what's it going to update? Let's say we want to update the theme. Let's update the theme. So we're going to go from light to dark theme. And we'll say, go dark. On click, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to dispatch an action. We dispatch an object. Its type will be update theme. Its payload will be dark. Basically, you could have copied and pasted this and just changed this value and this value. More than fine. And as we go along, before the end of class, I will clean this up too. We don't want these giant dispatch objects all over the place. So I'll talk about that too. So if you're thinking this is looking a little messy, it is. We want to clean that up. But for now, this is just illustrating the concept. So let's do this. Let's change this to backticks. Right. Oh, that's right. I have to wrap that in curly braces because now it's evaluation. And here we're going to say store.theme, which currently is nothing right now. We'll have to update that. Store.theme. And inside our store, we need to add another piece of another property to our state object so that store.theme makes sense. Let's come back up to our initial state. We'll say theme. By default, it'll be the light theme. So if I were to save everything right now, everything should still render. There's my button. The theme of the header is still a light theme. And we're going to add a new case statement because we have a new type that we're expecting. So we'll say case, update theme. We want to return our new state. Well, what are we updating? We're updating the theme, right? And that's going to be our action.payload value. Same thing as before. All we're doing is it's a different case statement. We're updating a new value. Caitlin should be smirking right about now. I think she knows what's coming up. All right, so now we're rendering theme. Okay, cool. So let's dispatch that action. Let's see this theme update, right? Because we're passing in payload as dark. Our theme should be the value of action.payload, which is dark. And Bootstrap accepts classes that are both bg-light and bg-dark. Let's do that. Go dark. Cool. What else happened? Let me refresh the page. Take a look at the nav bar. Go dark. The name went away. Anyone want to guess why? We go back here. Bonus points for the person that gets it first. What happened? This is an intentionally long, awkward silence. Return theme, yeah. That's all we returned. Our state object completely changed. So not only, and this illustrates a good point. So when you're returning from a reducer, you're returning that whole piece of state. So if you have multiple cases, you have to take into account all the other things that have not changed, not just what has changed. The quickest way to do this, and because this is a very simple piece of state, is to use that spread operator we talked about before. We're going to spread all of state in here first, and then we'll update other things later. Now we have access to state through this reducer function. If you remember, use reducer, it takes an initial state, but that's just so I can set it up. That's what this is. But afterwards, when we call this dispatch and dispatch that action and give it to the reducer, underneath the hood, React is going, hey, reducer, here's the current state of, well, state. This is the current state of your state store. That just sounds terrible. This is the current state of your piece of state. There we go. Do with it what you want. Oh, and by the way, here's the action that's coming. We're gonna say, okay, cool. Let's handle this thing. We're gonna say, okay, we're gonna switch on this type. I see this is naming. This is updating the username. I'm gonna return everything in state right now, so I don't lose anything. And then I'm gonna update this thing on top of that. But I wanna make sure that I do this second, because what happens if I spread state after the fact? Last in wins, right? So I gotta make sure all my changes happen after I've already spread state. So let's do this here. So it's in both spots. Now if I refresh, I hit go dark. Now it's working right. Does that make sense? Something to think about. Cool. All right. Let's see. Oh, I know what I wanted to talk about, and this will be what we'll talk about last for today's class. But before I do that, how's everyone feeling about this? Any questions? Give me a thumbs up if you're liking what you see. Give me a thumbs down if you're like, I'm never gonna use this. This is awful. At least I didn't see any thumbs down. That's good.
Say that now.
Yeah, this stuff's fun. Like I could do this all day long. And in fact, I do this stuff all day long.
I was just trying to explain this exact thing actually to somebody at work today who they're a back-end developer, so they're not familiar. I don't know why they have this task at all, but anyway.
Oh yeah, why? Unless they
because-
want to get into front end.
Yeah, I think it's just whatever. So I was trying to explain this whole thing and he was like, what? I don't get it. I was like, sorry.
Just point him to this YouTube video and
Yeah.
watch it.
I'll forward it tomorrow. Watch it at this minute.
Yeah, watch the second one. Cool. Yeah, so excellent. So let's kind of clean. Any other questions? I didn't look at the chat. Any other questions, or we just keep going?
I'm a little curious about the way you're using capitalization. I thought maybe it was just for dispatch for the values of
like
dispatch,
this?
but then it's also under store context and a couple other places. It seems like it's kind of inconsistent. I don't know what the convention is or whatever.
Sorry, my volume was a little low. I had to turn it up a little bit. I didn't realize it was that low.
I'm
Can you
just
repeat some of that?
wondering what the convention is for. You're using capitalization in different places. I thought at first it was just under the values of the different keys of dispatch, but then you're also using it for store context provider. There's just a few different places you're using.
Oh,
it.
like this, like it's all uppercase.
Yeah, because that's unusual for all the code we've seen so far.
Yeah, sorry. This is things I take for
It
granted.
has like a name.
All right, so capitalization or the casing that you choose has different context. So as you get more familiar with different patterns out there, seeing different casing automatically clicks in your head like, oh, that's what's going on there, right? So when in the case of React components, any component that you create should be upper camel case. Because if it's not, React's going to complain. It's going to say, oh, you're trying to create a native element like a div or a p tag, right? Those are lowercase, and they should be, because that's what they should be in HTML. When React sees something that starts with a capital letter, it says, oh, this is something you created, right? So I don't have to look at my native library. I'm going to be constructing something new, right? So that's what that convention is there. Our functions and our regular JavaScript variables, like this one here, these are lower camel case, right? Because that's the convention for things like that. When we see things like this, usually something that's all uppercase, like this, represents well, this const represents a variable, right? It's an object, which the contents of this variable could change, even though it's a const. We say consts don't change. Well, that's true, but what doesn't change is the reference to this thing in memory, not the value it holds, right? So I can use this convention that the contents of this object can change and will change as we're watching things happen, right? This, all uppercase, represents a constant variable that will never change, ever. Like, I don't update this. This is not some object that I update. This is not an array that I can push to or pop from. This usually represents, like in this case, I'm using it for context. So that tells me as a developer, hey, this is something that will never change, ever. Normally, we would also create constant variables that hold the values of these as well. So what that would look like would be like const update username equals update username. And then I would use this variable, right? So this says, oh, this is a constant and it's something that will never change. That's the convention, right? So all uppercase like that just represents a constant that doesn't change. Make sense now? So those conventions, you'll see them. Why did we use lowercase s for the folder name and the file name for the store component? Good question. Why did we do that? Well, the reason I did it is because store is not it's not the default export. There's other things in here that are not components that I'm also exporting. So since use store, these are all named exports. And they're all related to the store itself, not only the store components coming out of this thing, but there's ways to update the store. So that's why I chose lowercase. Like, it's not only a component, there's more stuff in here. And yeah, those are great questions. You could separate this stuff out and you could have a file that only has the default export of your context. You can have a file that only has the store component itself. You can have a file that only has the hook, right? You can break those out. And then that way, the file that only has this will be capitalized store. The file that has this would be like, lowercase use store hooks or store hooks or something like that, right? It all depends, again, on intent, right? What's inside this thing? If I look at this and I say, well, store.js, it probably contains logic for the store. It may or may not contain a component related to it. I don't know. I got to go search it, right? But if this was capital S, like I had started to write, I would expect that this is the only thing coming out of it, right? It's all about intent. Hopefully that answers your question there. Cool. Very good questions. Excellent. All right, so let's clean up. In fact, this is kind of a precursor to this thing here. I'm going to get rid of this first. Put this back as quotes. So it's a string. Now, the reason we don't want to have strings here for our case statements is because what if you need to change this thing? Well, if I wanted to change that name, I'd have to change it here. I'd have to change it here. I'd have to change it in the 5,000 other places I'm using this thing, right? Or could possibly be using it. Oh, sure, no problem. So what we want to do is create constant variables that hold the values of these things, so that if we ever needed to change it, we change the value of that constant in our code. We don't change the name of it, right? So it'll stay consistent. And what I mean by, just to clarify, we're going to change the value of the constant, meaning we as the developer are going to change its true meaning, its true value, not the program's going to update it. That's not what I meant. So just as the clarification there, because sometimes you say one thing, but it means something else completely, and you're gonna hear that a lot in programming. It's like, oh my gosh, how do you keep things straight? Like updating the state of your state, it's like, it's confusing. Cool. So let's, in addition to store, can I please repeat which part? I'm not sure which part. I just said. So you mean like things can mean different things even though they're called the same? Right. So when I say let's change the state of our state, right? I'm referencing the state as in its current state of being, but state is also the thing we call the object inside our store. It's kind of what I meant. It's just you're using the same name for different things, and you're going to come across that a lot in programming. Before that, I'm not exactly sure which. I've already forgot what I said.
What is about? Is it about updating the value of the?
Oh, updating the value of the constant.
Changing the constant.
Yeah. So when I said if you needed to change the value of that constant, what I meant was you go into the code, you say equals something else, not your programs. Your program's not going to update the constant if it's a string, right? You're going to go in, you're going to change the value of that constant and then recompile. It doesn't happen on the fly, right? So that's basically what I meant. All right, so let's clean this up. Oh, we're going to create a new, no problem. Oh, I'm in components. I don't want to go in components. In our store folder, we're going to create a new file. We'll call it actions.js.
I don't know how you managed to hit everything that I've done in a day then during class. 2 days in a row, very specifically.
I was like, ESPing it, right? Well, it's good. That's good timing. So we're going to create a file called actions.js, and you can kind of take a guess on what we're going to do in here. We're going to create some constants. We're going to create the one for update username in here equals update username. So this name of this variable is the same name as the string held inside of it. But what I meant was, what if you needed to change something? Like, you wouldn't change this, you'd change this. That's what I meant by changing the value of the constant. But in this case, changing this doesn't matter because this will always stay the same. So it's just basically, hey, this thing's not going to change. Use this value anywhere you want to use this, or use this constant anywhere you'd want to use this value. And we're also going to do another one for update theme because that's the other thing we got going on. I'll just copy, paste that. All right, so now we have our types. These are the types for our actions. Now let's create some actions themselves. Well, what do we do? For an action, right? Because our actions are objects, right? Like this. But we don't want to just say const, some action object here. That's not what we want to do. To make this a very clean, reusable thing, we're going to create a new function. And we're going to call that function the name of the type of action we're going to dispatch. Right, this is standard kind of convention, pretty common convention. And that's going to be equal to a function. That's going to return our action object itself. So if I were to, so type would be, in this case, it would be update username. And the payload, well, what is the payload? We want to reuse this action in many different places. We want to make this reusable. So we could say, hey, this is going to accept, I don't know, some text. Our payload will be the text we pass in when we call this function. So we can reuse this however many times we want. It'll always be the same type, so our store knows how to handle this type of action. But our payload could be different depending on where this action gets dispatched from inside our application. So that's good. Let's do another one. Do const update theme. And this one we'll do a little differently. Instead of update theme, let's call it toggle theme. We want to toggle from light to dark. So we'll update this here, call it toggle. And we don't need to pass in any arguments because we're going to do the logic regardless of what the user would pass in, right? We're only going to toggle between light and dark. So this is a very simple type of action where the only thing we need to return, we still need to return an object because it's still an action object, but the only thing we need to return is the type. We don't care about the payload. Our reducer is already going to know, hey, we're toggling between light and dark. Right? We're gonna bake that logic into our reducer so that the component just needs to say, hey, dispatch this toggle theme action, and it'll go back and forth eventually. So let's wire. Oh, the other thing we need to do is we need to export these, otherwise we can't use them. And we also need to export these as well. Because these are all reusable things. Do named exports for everything in our actions.js file. But anytime we need to update one of these actions to do something different or update a type, we only need to do it in one place. So let's see what this looks like from the store's point of view. Well, we need to import those things. So we're going to import a bunch of stuff from /actions. What are we going to import? We're going to import update username. Okay, so now we can say, we're going to use this constant. It's already been defined for us for this handling this type of action. Cool, we're good there. We're going to bring in toggle theme. Well, we need to change this one because we're going to do some different logic. So let's just say toggle theme. Don't worry about this right now. We'll get to that. Cool. So now we have our actions, or our types. I'm sorry, our action types. And this is how we'll handle that. For our toggle theme, we know that the payload, we don't have a payload, right? What do we have instead? Well, we have the current state of our theme. So now we can say our theme is now going to be if state.theme equals light, we'll make it dark. Otherwise, we'll make it light again, because if it's not light, it's dark. So it would be this. If it's light, it's dark. So simple ternary. So that will be our new theme. And the rest of this is okay because we're still expecting a payload from update username. We're still going to get that from our action object. So now that we've handled everything related to our new action updates in our store, let's take a look from the point of view of our header.js. Again, we're going to need to import a couple of different things. We're going to import from // store actions, right? Store folder with the actions file. And what are we up? We're doing update username and toggle theme. These are functions that return action objects. And the way that looks down here is we're no longer going to dispatch these things. Instead, what we'll dispatch are these the return values of calling these functions. And the way that looks is we dispatch update username. And remember that one takes text. So we could say logged out. And this one is toggle theme. But that doesn't take any arguments. So we just call the function. And when we call these functions, we get back the objects that are our action objects. We could save that. Let's test it out. So let's log out. Still works. Go dark doesn't make sense anymore, but it still toggles it. So that part works. So let's update one thing to make everything consistent here. So instead of go dark, what can we do? We could say, well, store.theme, if that equals light, we're going to say go dark. Otherwise, we'll say go light. There we go. So now we have access to our store and access to a way to dispatch actions that eventually will become changes in our store. We never update the store directly from a component, ever. We always use the dispatch, whether it's through context like this, using use dispatch or use reducer, or if you're using libraries like Redux, you never touch the store. You always let the reducer figure out what the next state of the store should be. And the way we do that is we dispatch actions that show the intent of what we want to change. Does that all make sense? Thumbs ups if it does. Any other icon if it doesn't? Hopefully there's no like train wreck icon showing up. But yeah, so this is a pretty complex subject. Hopefully I simplified it enough for you to understand at least the concept of it and to see, you know, the basic pattern. Like from here, the only complexity from here is how much it grows, right? There's ways to kind of divvy this out even further. Like you can have reducers inside of other reducers that handle even more minute parts of different parts of your application. So you can nest these reducers together and they all eventually make it back to one state object. So it can get complex, but really what it is you're just repeating the same pattern over and over. You're just diving deeper and deeper, right? But you're still repeating these same patterns. And this pattern exists throughout all these types of state management type of solutions. It's this is very Reduxy because Redux came kind of before the use reducer hook was created. So it was already a very popular pattern, and that's why React implemented it. It's basically the Redux pattern, but we just have to wire it up for ourselves. But yeah, so you'll see this pattern very common, and a lot of people use just straight up context to update their applications. If you don't have a very, very large app, then this is all you'd need for your complex store state. And that brings us to basically the end of class today. So, which is great timing because I wanted to go slow enough to cover it, but still be able to make it in on time. And we still have 8 minutes to go, so that's awesome. So the rest of the time, ask your questions, fill out your 30-second survey if you want to. I think that's optional now. And then, yeah, let me know what you think, or if you have any comments, or if you had any aha moments or light bulbs going off or revelations, let me know about that. Hopefully you're really enjoying the React stuff. I know a bunch of you have already wanted to convert your capstones over to React, and that's awesome. I love React. You know, I do it all day long. It's my job. If I had to change to another framework, I would, if I had to. As long as I have the option to stick with React, I'll stick with it. But I'm not like, you know, I wouldn't call myself like a fanboy of React. I use it because it makes sense to me and it works for what, you know, the projects I'm working on use it for. But that doesn't mean like I don't put down other frameworks that are out there. So if you hear like people complaining about, oh, never use this because it's terrible and all this other stuff, well, that's just their opinion, right? So if there's a framework that you like and that solves a problem that you're having and it solves it eloquently, use it. It doesn't matter if other people don't like it. It solved your problem. And what if you're making $1 million a year on it? Who's laughing now, right? So never discount other solutions that are out there. They may feel like they don't match what you're thinking about, like maybe they don't match your project, and that's okay. Just use the ones that do. Yeah, so I'll leave the rest up to you guys. If you want questions, ask them away. Otherwise, we are complete for today. So we'll hang around. I'll keep this going right up until 8:30, and then I'll push these changes up too tonight so that you have the state stuff in here. And feel free to fiddle around with it and add new pieces, add new actions or new parts of the dispatcher if you want. Yeah, add it to other components, right? Other components, import the use store hook, and then try to access other parts of the, or try to update other parts. If you don't have any questions, you feel free to drop. I'll just stick around until 8:30 just in case. But yeah, we're good. So don't feel compelled that you have to stay just because I'm here. And for all those that are dropping off, have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow.
Can you talk about the plan for tomorrow again? I know you touched on it a couple times, but can you just kind of outline?
Yeah, so I wasn't sure if this would flow into tomorrow. So we're at a great stopping point for state today. I think we covered it really well. I would say if you want, if any of this doesn't make sense, today's video is a great video to rewatch. I don't think I really missed anything there's nothing I think that I missed that I wanted to share with you guys regarding this. From here on out, it's basically learning the different state management solutions that are out there, right? So if you wanted to learn about Redux, visit their site, and it'll look really familiar based on what you've seen here. It's just they have a little bit more functionality baked in. We're kind of bare bonesing it. But at the heart of it all, this is essentially the type of pattern you'd see. But for tomorrow, what I'm thinking is I'm going to leave, for the first half, we'll talk about if you are going to use a Create React app solution for your capstone and you eventually want to deploy it, we'll talk about what it would take to deploy, to get the code out of this in a state that you would upload to a server. It's easier than you probably think it is. Create React app makes it really easy to do that. And it's probably only going to take about 5 minutes. Like it's that quick. There's a lot of ways to deploy applications and a lot of different solutions that are out there. Create React app makes a real easy one if you want to just use, if you're not going to eject this and customize the build pipeline tools, which I'll talk about. In fact, what I might do is I'll whip up a, just an example, like Create React app, make like one change and then I'll eject it to show what you have access to after that. But if you never eject it and you just want to deploy it, there's a really easy way to just ship what you got. So we'll go over that. If there's any questions on anything we've gone through over the application, I'll leave a good chunk of class open for just questions in general, like not just React, but JavaScript. So I can answer questions related to React or JavaScript. In fact, last cohort, I actually taught part of the JavaScript, like the advanced JavaScript module. So any questions you got for JavaScript, feel free to ask them. How long did it take for you to create this project? This took, if I were to sit down from start to finish, I believe it took, with all the CSS and the tweaking, that would have been a 40-hour work week.
The CSS takes the longest.
Yeah, well, I was going off already existing mockups, which sped up a little bit of it. Maybe not 40. I'd say more like 30. It's a 30-hour effort. right? No, I take that back. I'll say 40. I had to write the backend for it. So, right, the whole mock API, I wrote that from scratch. So I wanted to make sure that it mimicked what you'll see like with Node in creating API endpoints. So it had to feel like the same thing that's going to happen. So that took a little bit of time to make sure that that worked out. But yeah, good 40-hour work week for that project. I also wanted to make sure it was clear enough and that I could repeat what I did in class, right? Because I can write this stuff and then be like, oh, how did I do that again? You know, and I don't want to sit there and fumble. So I had to make sure I wrote it in such a way that it was easy to kind of reiterate. Like it had already been I wrote this a couple months ago. So I had to make sure that when I touched on it again, it wasn't going to be completely foreign and I could actually teach it. So those things, you know, over time, it gets easier to write stuff like that, but it takes time. Like literally CSS was like half the project because you're fiddling and tweaking it, you know, an hour or two at a time just for simple little things. Caitlin's smiling. She loves CSS. It's her friend.
I do love it. Nobody else loves it at work, but I love it. It's fine. I'll take one for the team there.
Yeah. Oh yeah, your question that includes API resource. Absolutely. Any other questions? I think tomorrow's class will probably be shorter. I'll leave it up to like, you know, let's go over a few things and then let's leave it up to kind of addressing some of your concerns or some of your problems that you're having with maybe your capstone and converting things to React or something like that. All right, so we're at day 30. If there's no other questions, I will see you all tomorrow and we'll wrap up our React module. So have a great night, everyone.
Bye, thanks.